Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Apostate of Mind, the new channel on YouTube where I present to you critical commentary of the Bible, the Christian Bible, the Jewish Bible, and we talk critically as well about Christianity and religion as a whole. And so this is your first time with us. I want to welcome you. I'm Mark Peralta, and I'm a former pastor and seminary graduate. I, just to summarize briefly, originally set out to be a Bible translator. I grew up in South America where I spoke Spanish first, and then as a kid, my parents migrated to the U.S., and I had to learn English here. And so later in high school, I learned Italian, and I felt like languages were something that came natural to me. And I continued on with a graduate education where at Dallas Seminary, I learned how to translate the Bible from its original language. And so it's been quite the journey, and I'm proud to be here with your ear, so we can discuss some of the things that are critical to even my own personal deconversion from Christianity, from religion as a whole. I'm an atheist now, and I went through ups and downs where I doubted what I was reading, but then insisted by way of faith, and kept on until I couldn't keep on lying to myself and to others. And so here we are. And what I've got prepared for you, and bear with me, this is only my second live transmission, and this is very new to me. And it's really challenging, to be honest with you. But I'm so glad that you are here with me, and we're going to feature a video, another one of the podcasts from One for Israel, which is a ministry that caught my interest a few months ago because they are catering to they seem to be catering to a Jewish community in Israel where they are preaching the gospel, and many of them are perhaps former Jews that have now been converted to a Messianic Christianity in Israel. And so they proclaim their interpretation, and they affirm basic Christian beliefs in through their podcast. Not only that, but they do feature scholars that are prominent today, like Craig Keener and others, that bring some very valid points to the Christian argument for Christological interpretation of the Jewish Bible, which, as I have affirmed before, I don't believe that what Christians refer to as the Old Testament is indeed an Old Testament, in the sense that it creates somewhat of a link, a volume 1, volume 2 type of relationship, when in reality it's just a Hebrew Bible. And most certainly, if you are critical of the claims of the New Testament authors regarding what they see as Christological fulfillments of prophecies in the Old Testament, I disagree with how they read the Old Testament, how they see the Jewish Bible. And it is through this channel, which I hope to show you the many different examples and reasons why I don't believe that the Hebrew Bible leads to what is being said in the New Testament. Meaning that New Testament authors, whether they be the gospel writers or Paul or whoever else wrote the remaining epistles, that they are incorrect in reading Jesus into Hebrew Bible passages and in many occasions ripping them out of context, and quoting them in the New Testament as a way to argue that this Messiah character, Jesus of Nazareth, was indeed the fulfillment of some messianic prophecy or a set of messianic prophecies that one can clearly read in the Hebrew Bible. I beg to differ. So we've done a few, and today we're going to look into Psalm 22:17, which poses a problem in terms of how scholars ought to translate this passage. And we'll get into the details of the language itself. But what I like to do is go ahead and cue One for Israel, which basically they're going to argue that the correct interpretation is one that reads in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ in there. But I'm going to let them introduce for us the issue. I think they do a pretty good job in talking about it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and play. Come on, mouse.
Welcome to Pod for Israel. This is Dr. Seth Postel. I'm here with Dr. Golan Broshi, and we're continuing our series on the case for Messiah, an Old Testament defense of the New Testament faith. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at Psalm 22, verse 16 in the English, or in the Hebrew, verse 17. And the big debate is whether the original says, "They pierced my hands and my feet," or "like a lion, my hands and my feet."
Yeah, so in Hebrew, it's all pinned to one word.
Just one word?
Yeah, so you want me to read the Hebrew Masoretic text? The Hebrew says, "Ki sevavuni klavim, adat mereim hikifuni, ka'ari," that's the word, ka'ari, yadai v'raglai.
Wait a minute, you've got pretty good Hebrew there, Golan. Way to go.
I'm working on my Hebrew. So what does the English say?
Okay, so the New American Standard, the New American Standard translates the original, right? "For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers have encompassed me, they pierced my hands and my feet." The version that Golan read, the Masoretic text, says, "Dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me." Now the JPS is "like lions," but actually it's just singular, "like a lion, my hands and my feet." And so what is the difference actually, if we're going to be looking at the Hebrew, what is the difference between "they pierced" and "like a lion"?
Yeah, so it changes the whole meaning of the verse. If it's a lion or pierced, and these are some of the objections we get from my brothers and sisters, the rabbin in rabbinic Judaism.
And apparently the difference is actually the difference between a vav and a yud, right?
Only, the tip of a yud.
A couple of millimeters makes a big difference, right?
Exactly, just the vav in the end. Is it a vav or a yud?
So maybe you're wondering why in the world Golan and I would be talking about this verse. And actually, there are some videos on YouTube, and we've heard this, some of the claims of anti-missionaries that are trying to, in some ways, try to tell Christians that their version of the Bible, their Old Testament, has been corrupted, yes. Right? And so some of the claims about the anti-missionaries, particularly with this verse, they would claim, first of all, the Christians, claim one, the Christians corrupted the original Hebrew, which says, "like a lion," and they changed it to "they pierced" after the time of Jesus, and all in order to prove that Psalm 22 prophesied the crucifixion.
And the anti-missionaries like to emphasize the Christian Bible versus the Jewish Bible.
Correct.
The Christian Bible.
Correct. The second claim is they would argue, right, that the word ka'ari,
everywhere else in the Bible,
it means "like a lion," but for some reason Christians here choose to translate it differently.
Yeah.
All right. Claim 3, there are two other verses in Psalm 22 refer to lions. So if you're reading through Psalm 22, two other times lions are mentioned. Yeah. So of course,
so naturally,
this has to be "like a lion."
Yep.
It just goes with the rest of the context.
Yep.
Claim 4, right, which is the big claim.
That's a big one.
Right? I can prove to you that the Christians corrupted this verse. Why? Because the New Testament actually never quotes this verse. And therefore, if that verse would have been in the original reading, they would have used it for sure.
Yep.
Okay. Claim 5.
And the last claim.
Psalm 22 is only about King David. Nowhere in the text is it inferred that it's about the Messiah.
So it couldn't be a messianic prophecy because it talks only about the historical King David.
Correct. And so the reason that we're talking today is we feel it's very important to deal with these claims, right? To respond to them.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll start with the first claim. We'll go claim by claim and see if it.
All right. So before we allow him to continue on, first off, yeah, he does summarize the issue more or less. But I do want to read an excerpt from a journal from the Journal of Biblical Literature. This was an article published in 2004, where it deals directly with the issue related to the translation of Psalm 22, verse 17. And the title of the journal is Circling Around the Problem Again, where it goes like this. It reads, "The problem of how to read Psalm 22:17, especially the second part of the verse, has troubled scholars for centuries and has received renewed attention in several recent articles. One word in particular is in dispute, appearing as in the Hebrew, ka'ari, in the Masoretic text, which is the primary text that Bible translators are going to use for translating into different Bible versions. Interpretations generally fall into one of two categories: treating the problematic word either as a noun or as a verb. So essentially, the problem with that is that there's ambiguity in the Hebrew word itself as to whether it's referring to a noun, which would be the case of how the Jewish publication does their rendering of this passage, of this verse, like a lion, or is it a verb? And if so, what verb is that? It says, if treated as a verb, there are several possibilities. Initial comparison with the ancient versions suggests that the best solution is to read a verb here, since all of the verbs. One second. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and feature the actual screen that I'm from where I'm reading. You bear with me. Okay. Okay. If treated as a verb, there are several possibilities. Initial comparison with the ancient versions suggests that the best solution is to read a verb here, since all of the ancient versions except the Targum do so. However, that the ancient versions and subsequent scholars do not agree which verb should be read, and that the Targum reads both a verb and a noun undermine confidence in such a conclusion. Ancient scholars seem to have been as puzzled as we are about how best to read this text, and recent studies, none of which claims to have determined an entirely satisfactory solution, confirms its difficulty. So, at the very least, we could say that it's not a done deal. There are clear issues with how to properly translate this verb or noun. And unfortunately, for those that are promoting Christianity, that this passage gets used and thrown around as like solid evidence from the Old Testament that Jesus is the fulfilled Messiah, and that the Messiah had to be crucified. I mean, that's how that passage is often used. And I know that in the New Testament, uh, Jesus is quoted by some of the Gospels. I'm not sure if all of them quote. I think only two, but they cite verse 1 of this Psalm 22, the famous Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, as a way for Jesus to sort of quote the entire chapter, or the entire psalm, I should say, as if he is announcing that he is fulfilling whatever is being said on that psalm. Because in antiquity, there was this practice of, due to the lack of chapter numbers and proper divisions in the scriptures, that it was common practice, and it might still be today, for Bible or scroll readers, I should say, to cite or make reference to an entire chapter by quoting the first verse of said chapter. However, if we analyze the whole chapter critically, we can quickly notice that perhaps even Jesus's own quoting of that chapter is somewhat problematic, because the chapter doesn't necessarily seem to be describing a future prophetic event that, meant to change things forever for the Jewish faith. It doesn't seem to be actually referring to a Messiah character per se. It's a passage. It's a psalm that has often been. I mean, it's a psalm of David, and it's describing David's own plight, his own struggle at the time, whatever inspired him to write that. And so we must first, as Bible readers, and honest learners of the scriptures, to question ourselves, what does this psalm really say? And once we understand what the psalm really says, can we attribute any validity to the Christian interpretation of verse 17 as a prophecy of some future crucifixion? So let's consider those things as we play through the video. Let's see. We're gonna let him take one point at a time, and then we'll discuss at least my own perspective. And I will admit, I'm not 100% sure as to how one should translate this verse in particular. I think that some things are missing. I think something's missing on the text itself. And if it's ambiguous, if it's not clear, then one should not make such great affirmations as to say that this proves that, this Messiah had to be crucified. All right, let's see. Point number one, or claim number one, as he's almost strawmanning every point. Let's see.
It holds water.
That's a good idea. So claim number one,
Yep.
the Christians
Corrupted. The Christians
corrupted the original text.
Yeah.
So they, after the time of Jesus, in the Greek, they changed it from like a lion to they pierced, in order to prove that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Greek Old Testament, prophesied the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yep.
So what do you think?
So according to biblical scholars, Israelis, Jewish scholars, this claim doesn't hold water. There was no corruption in the Christian Bible.
That's
and we
interesting.
And we have a few quotes of Israeli scholars that are admitting
You know
there's
what's
a problem.
So when I listened or watched these YouTube videos, I got the sense in which, Christians, because they don't read Hebrew, biblical Hebrew or modern Hebrew, they don't realize that there's, that this is just a Christian issue. The Christians think that there's a problem with the text, but we actually found there's at least 4 Hebrew scholars
and the
modern Israeli scholars.
Exactly. And the problem with most of the anti-missionaries that they don't read the Hebrew scholarship,
the modern Hebrew
exactly.
scholars. Okay, so Norit Reich, Meir Malul, David Flusser, Meir Kister, they all saw a problem with Psalm 22, verse 17.
Because
why?
It lacks a verb.
Like a lion, my hands and my feet.
Like a lion what? What did the lion do?
Exactly.
Okay, so let me show you on the Bible software that I use the actual language so that you can see, or I could better show you what they mean. Okay. So here's a Bible verse. And in front of you on the very far left is the Hebrew text. The middle column is the Jewish Publication Society translation. And here I should have, what can we do? Let's do some evangelical translation. That's kind of a modern translation. See, the New American Standard. Okay, I hope everyone can see this. Try to make it as big as possible. So if you compare side by side the Jewish translation into English and the New American Standard Bible, you can see some differences and you can see some similarities. They both agree in the first part of the verse where it reads or translates dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me. In the NASB, it reads, "For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me." But then in the second part of the verse is where they differ greatly. On one, it reads, "They pierced my hands and my feet." That's on the NASB. And the Jewish translation reads, "Like lions, they maul my hands and feet." Now, make note, the verb in the Jewish publication, "they maul," is in brackets. And the reason why the verb is bracketed is because they are recognizing that in their translating, there isn't a verb in that particular clause. But the verb or the action is implied. And so from their perspective, they don't see a problem that it lacks a verb. And the implied action is one which a lion would do, which is mauling. And so they list it there. In the evangelical Bible translation, it reads, "They pierced my hands and my feet." So you ask yourself, like, what in the world is going on? Like, how these are two very different renderings of the same Hebrew text. So why are they so different? And it all centers around this Hebrew word kari, which I've highlighted there on the left, which somehow, or I think I've got an idea, modern Bible translators have chosen to translate it with this verb pierced, completely ignoring the fact that when they look at the Hebrew text, there isn't a verb. And so what's happening? And so what this leads to is, if you're a Christian and you read Psalm 22 verse 16, I mean, what's going to come to mind, right? They pierced my hands and my feet. I mean, the preacher will say, well, that's the crucifixion right there. Here's clear-cut evidence that David prophesied that the Messiah would be crucified. And so we have to ask ourselves critically, like, how can they possibly get away with that? Like, what would lead them to say that? Well, if you read the Greek text, and why is that important? Well, the Greek text of the Hebrew Bible, because that would have been the text that would have been circling around in Galilee and in Judea at the time of Jesus' ministry. And the Greek text is understood by scholars to be what would have been available for them at the time of all the Christian important events. So why am I trying to? Why do we need to look at the Greek text? Well, we need to look at the Greek text because the Greek text actually has it was the first translation, and that as a first translation, well, however way they translated it, we should probably consider it important. I don't know. I'm having trouble pulling it up. Let me see. It's hard to do this while speaking at the same time. I do know I have an LXX here. Here we go. Okay, so the Greek text, which was the translation available to Jesus or to the gospel authors, reads something that could be translated as pierced, but it's a bit ambiguous. The word they used in the LXX is oruso, which let's look up in the Greek dictionary what it means. This is the BDAG. Those of you that are familiar with lexicons of the Old Testament, of the Septuagint, of the LXX, this is the authoritative lexicon that modern Bible translators ought to consult when weighing in the different meanings of any particular word in the Greek. And I think even for the New Testament as well. Anyway, BDAG identifies at least three different renderings of that same, three different options. Number one, to loosen material by digging. And it says focus on the activity as such, dig up. Okay, so to loosen material by digging, it sounds like something that you would do in a garden with a shovel. Not quite pierced. Second option says to prepare a place for something by digging out, prepare by digging. And again, I see that the editors of the lexicon point towards use of the same verb on Matthew 21:33, where it talks about planting a vineyard. So it still kind of has that same agricultural use of that verb. And then finally, they identify a third option, make a hole in something by digging, to dig a hole. To dig a hole in something, like when you dig a hole on the ground at the beach. I mean, it still sounds the same. I'm not sure how much differently each and every one of these options are, but they certainly don't point to anything related to piercing. So the issue is not a matter of what modern objectors to a Christian interpretation of Psalm 22:16, but rather a problem that has been going on for a long time. Um, if anything, you could simply consider the context of when the psalm would have been authored, and if indeed it was something that David wrote, right? That's about 1,000 years prior to Christianity, and during the time of David, there was no Roman Empire. There was not even a Greek Empire. It was preceded by other. There was the Assyrians, later Babylonians, but there was no Greek Empire. There was no Roman Empire yet. And unfortunately, for those that want to give this a Christian interpretation or a Christian spin, crucifixion was introduced by the Romans as a form of public humiliation and execution. This was not something that contemporaries of David would have known anything about. And they would have been quite familiar with other forms of execution like stoning, but not crucifixion. So to suggest that the original author of this psalm intended to mean that there's a crucifixion here, it's anachronistic. It doesn't really fit. You have to ignore timelines in order to accept this type of reading. The other thing too that I will admit, even if it did read, "They pierced my hands and feet," that in and of itself is not crucifixion exclusively. I think that people have been tortured in all kinds of ways. And I'm not sure if that would have been something that was practiced in antiquity, but simply the piercing or the digging of something does not necessarily imply that this Roman form of crucifixion, which means that it's ambiguous enough that you kind of have to consider the overall context of that entire verse to be able to set boundaries as to how you're going to translate or how you're going to render or drive meaning behind this translation, as indeed is a little tricky because it's not a clear word. It seems that way. Something else I do want to point out is that scholars have also identified that there's a better word in the Hebrew. I don't know, did you know this? The verb dakar, that's Dalet Kaf Resh, is a better choice if the author were to intend piercing. Very similar to when we talked about Isaiah in the translating of that famous passage of the virgin shall conceive, in that the author had available to him, if he did indeed meant to point something concerning the sexuality of that young woman, that he could have used, if he meant to say virgin, he could have used Batula. But he didn't. So we must then question or be careful in affirming such strict translation of that. Similarly, here, the author would have had a much more direct, a much more clear word or verb in this case, if he really did mean to talk about any kind of piercing. But he did not. And so that's to me, that's the main issue there. Let me see if I can get caught up with some of your comments here. I see many of you have written and I've been just ignoring you. But I'm so glad you guys are here. Hablando con Mo. Mo, what's up, buddy? I hope you're still around. You are so entertaining, man. I'm glad that that we met. And what's up, Alma? Alma, you are so great. Let's see. All right. Well, let's continue on. Let's continue on. We're featuring the ministry One for Israel, who is a ministry in Israel dedicated to preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and their own interpretation of the Jewish scriptures with a Messianic spin, which I disagree in many of their conclusions. And this is one of those that gets thrown around as, here's the proof that Jesus is the fulfilled Jewish Messiah, and therefore you should believe him or accept him. But indeed, it's based on a poor translation, in a somewhat deceptive way to spin the translation, the Hebrew text. Let's see.
It lacks a verb.
You know, it's really interesting that even the JPS, which is the Jewish translation of this text, okay, notice how they translate it. Dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me. It's like lions, even though the original Hebrew says like a lion.
They put an S in the end.
They put an S, like lions, they maul my hands and my feet.
So they go after Rashi, chafu, to maul, to dig. Yeah, they did something to my head, but they added the verb.
Why did they add the verb?
They had to.
Why? Because the original Hebrew
doesn't have it.
The Hebrew of the Masoretic text is missing that verb. Yeah. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
If it's a lion, it's missing a verb.
What's also really interesting is that if we look at the old Greek translation.
Yeah, except there's no issue with it missing a verb. I mean, there are many moments in which verbs are implied, and that's, if anything, that's a recognized way to put emphasis on a certain aspect of poetry in the Hebrew writings, is to sort of a metaphor by omission in a way. So it's okay that a verb might be missing, and so you have to think of context as to why and what could possibly be that. So,
okay, the old Greek translation, the word probably comes from the word kara, kahu, right? Which is not a normal word for pierced. It usually has to do with digging,
right.
Digging pits, digging mines. Okay, so it's not your typical word for piercing.
But at least it's a verb.
It's a verb, exactly.
Okay, so you'd rather just spin it your own way because at least it's a verb, because it must have a verb. No, it doesn't have to have a verb. You're reading that verb into it is what you're doing.
Exactly. Okay, textual evidence. Let's talk about the textual evidence. Did the Christians corrupt the text? Okay, let's talk about it.
Yes, I don't believe they did.
So some of the evidence. So for instance, we actually know that they found in Nachal Hever, Dead Sea Scrolls,
the Qumran.
They found a text. I realize that it's a bit argued whether, what does it read kahu or Ka'ari, is it a verb? But
it wasn't corrupted by Christians.
correct.
That's for sure.
Correct. So we actually have ancient Hebrew support that it wasn't corrupt.
The thing is that first of all, to kind of label it as a corruption is sort of like, using it as a way of arguing, it's kind of like the conspiracy theorists, they're just like exaggerating everything. But it's not about a corruption. I mean, it's a real dilemma, but only when you're translating it to a modern language, because you have to deal with what you have. So perhaps the early church, when they read Psalm 22:17, they very much read it from the perspective of the Greek text, not the Hebrew text, where by the time that the Hebrew text became the Greek text, the issue of the translation had already taken place, because it went from what appears to be like a lion to they pierced my hands and feet. Oh, like a lion, blank, my hands and feet, to they pierced my hands and feet, which is what the Greek translation is now telling everyone. This is what that says. So perhaps that's where the issue went on. And when the Greek text was, when that translation became available of those Psalms, perhaps this was even prior to the start of Christianity. So you can't really claim that the translators of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek text were purposely trying to change the text to sound more Christological. No, they just simply were not 100% accurate as to how they translated it. They made perhaps some mistakes, which, if anything, shows their humanity, just as scholars today, or even boards of scholars, do still make translation errors. People in the past were even more prone to make errors. So perhaps that's where everything started. However, today, now that we know better, scholars, or I should say committees of Bible publications, should adjust their translations in light of, all of the scholarship, not just what was available to Christian interpreters in the first century.
Corrupted. We also know that all the ancient versions other than the Masoretic text, and the Midrash Yalkut Shimoni.
There's even a rabbinic midrash that uses a verb, either witchcraft or digging, but uses the verb for this like a lion. It doesn't use a lion, it uses the verb.
So you're saying that originally that these Jewish versions, right, the Jewish ancient versions and the Jewish interpretations understood this word as a verb. They did something to my hands and feet.
They had to grammatically. They had to use it. They knew that it must be a verb.
Because the Masoretic text doesn't make sense as it reads.
Exactly.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think that it does. It does make sense if you look at the overall reading of what's happening, which, you know what, it might be, I think it's worth looking at the overall text. What does it say, right? We'll stick to the Jewish publication. Oh, we are in the, what is this? This is the LXX. We'll change it. Okay, I don't know what's going on. It's acting weird. Oh, I know why. No. Tell you what, let me play the video while I get that ready.
The old Greek translation, okay, they dug out or they bore holes in my hands, in my feet, okay? So we know, therefore, that the Hebrew text, that the translator that translated this into Greek, he had a Hebrew that said either kahu or ka'ahu,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, digging, making holes, piercing, something like that.
So the bottom line, okay, based on the textual evidence.
No corruption.
Are you sure the Christians didn't later on corrupt the Hebrew
We
text?
have no evidence that any Christian ever in the first century or before corrupted the text. No evidence whatsoever.
So we actually have.
Okay. I'm going to start from verse 12. Don't be far from me, for trouble is near, and there's none to help. Many bulls surround me. Mighty ones of Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths at me like tearing, roaring lions. My life ebbs away. All my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax, melting within me. My vigor dries up like a shard. My tongue cleaves to my palate. You commit me to the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, my hands and feet. I take the count of all my bones while they look and gloat. They divide my clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. But you, O Lord, which we're going to get to why we need to look at the Hebrew text when we read that verse. Be not far off, my strength hasten to my aid. And it continues on. But getting back to our original verse here, where the translation is in question, I want you to notice that the author here is making use of several metaphors. He's not speaking of literal events or little things that are happening. Scholars have identified at least the use of 4 different animals that are used as metaphors to communicate David's plight, David's fears, whatever experience or turmoil that he was experiencing at the time. The first one is on verse 13, which we read, where it reads that bulls are surrounding him. Then on verse 14, it talks about a lion. Okay. So, roaring lions. It should be noted that the word that translates lions is that same word on verse 17, like a lion. It's the Ari. So there's even repetition here. Then it describes the physical effects of pain and death in verses 15 and 16. In verse 17, it mentions of dogs surrounding him. And like lions, my hands and feet. Now, I read the rest of the publication that I led with at the beginning of the episode, which I won't read again. I mean, I won't read more into it. I'll just kind of give you the gist. But essentially, what modern critical scholars have to say about this text is that they're just not for sure. It's somewhat ambiguous as to how they should translate, because really there is a verb that's missing. In the Hebrew text, it simply reads like lions, my hands and feet. It's missing a verb there. And so what that verb is must be drawn from its surrounding context. It must make sense. And so if the passage is describing by use of metaphors, such as these dogs and these lions and so forth, as not literal things, but figurative meaning of other things happening, such as the fear of being chased by someone that wants to kill you. I think I remember that David feared for his life many times, as many kings have in antiquity. And the overall feeling of someone's about to or wants to kill me is what is in view here. But the author is describing it using poetic language. So you can't take the literal meaning of poetic language and say, well, with regards to verse 17, there's nothing figurative happening here, but rather something very literal happening all of a sudden, such as a crucifixion, right? Because why would the author describe all things happening to him by way of animals and metaphors, and then all of a sudden in verse 17 make a full stop with poetic language and say, well, this is to be applied literally, and by the way, it's only relevant to events that will take place 1,000 years later. But to me, that's much harder to believe. But I don't know. Maybe there's something else. Let's see what else they can say, because I'm just not convinced yet that this could be.
Have a pre-Christian debate
Exactly.
as to whether this text read, they pierced,
Or like a lion.
or they bound,
Yeah.
or like a lion, my
Exactly.
hands and my feet. Okay, so no textual corruption.
Exactly.
We're good.
No corruption.
Are you sure?
Yeah, we can go to claim number 2.
Okay.
And then there doesn't have to be any textual corruption, because it's not about the texts. It's not about the LXX. It's not about the Greek text. It's not about the Jewish Bible. It's about how eventually those texts become translated and printed by the NIV, et cetera, et cetera. That's where the issue is. Because when the committee says we're gonna go with they pierced, they're making an interpretive decision for you and I. And I would argue that they're incorrect for doing so.
Okay, so everywhere else,
That's claim number 2.
those that want to defend the Masoretic text, they say the Masoretic text that we have today is the original reading, like a lion, my hands and my feet. So they say, okay, that everywhere else ka'ari means like a lion.
Yeah, everywhere else in the Bible that the word kari, like a lion, the English translations and all the other translated it as a lion. So
Okay.
why here? Yeah.
Okay, so he's saying that, so they say that here they ignore that and they change
They
it.
changed it because they wanted it to fit the Messianic narrative.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. Is this the Masoretic text like a lion? Is it every other time like a lion, ka'ari?
So the thing is, every time in the Bible, and especially in the Torah, that ka'ari appears as a lion, there's a verb attached to it. A verb. Ka'ari as a lion, what? What did the lion do? What did you do as a lion?
Interesting. So you're saying that if that word ka'ari appears and everywhere else it appears like a lion, everywhere else
In the Bible?
it always appears with a verb.
Exactly.
So for instance, Numbers 23, verse 24, like a lion, it lifts itself up.
Lifts. Yeah, it lifts itself.
It has a verb.
Yep.
Numbers 24:9, he couches,
Yeah, okay. So you can point at other examples in the Hebrew Bible where that word, that noun, is accompanied by a verb. And indeed, there are these examples. However, that does not mean that you now can take the liberty of saying, well, because in the Hebrew Bible it's lacking a verb, that you are then going to insert any verb that you see fit, right? If it's lacking the verb and there's no manuscript evidence that can reveal to us what that verb was at some point, if it ever existed, that you could determine for you and I when you translate it into English or to Spanish or whatever, that you can now choose for that the verb is therefore pierced. When that's not even the lexical definition of the in the Greek, that you could point towards, like, okay, well, in the Greek text it uses a verb and that verb means what? To pierce? No, it means to dig. And even more so, you're trying to say that not only does it mean pierced, but that piercing is just it's nothing but the crucifixion. And I don't think that you can say that. You could say there's a problem there, or we don't know exactly how to translate it, but don't affirm something. Don't bring meaning into it, unless you're really justified, and I don't think you are.
lies down like a lion.
Lies down.
Ka'ari.
Exactly.
Okay, Isaiah 38, verse 13, like a lion, so he breaks all my bones.
Yep, and that makes sense grammatically.
Yeah, if anything, what you're showing here is evidence against your claim, because you are admitting that in the Hebrew Bible, ka'ari is used to describe something related to what a lion would do. Okay. So I don't see how there being other usages of the same word along with a verb somehow equal to this is the crucifixion.
Like a lion?
Got it.
A verb. What did the lion do? Or what did somebody do like a lion? What did he do? A verb, which is missing in Psalm 22.
So
Right. So don't add it. Don't come up with a verb then. At least the Jewish publication puts brackets on it. I don't know if you've seen it, but I'll show it to you. They at least include brackets. Here you go. See? Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. It's in brackets, meaning it's implied. We cannot affirm with 100% certainty, but we can, by way of context, affirm that. And certainly this is not talking about crucifixion.
what's really interesting is that everywhere else the word ka'ari appears in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, it always appears with a verb.
Exactly.
Everywhere except
Psalm 22, verse 16. And what about the hand and the legs?
Okay, interesting. And so, again, the Masoretic text reads, like a lion, my hands and my feet, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what about my hands and my feet? What did they do to my hands and my feet?
So everywhere else in the Bible, when it appears, and it doesn't appear a lot, connected, hands and my legs connected, but every time it appears, and especially in the Torah, it has a verb also. My hands and my feet, what? What happens to my
Exodus 30, verse 21, they shall wash their hands and their feet.
wash,
So it has a verb.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, here's an interesting verse. Judges 16, Judges 1, verses 16 and 17, the English translation says this: he caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. But what does the Hebrew say there?
Yadeihem ve'ragleihem, hands and feet, and there's a verb before it.
So whenever we see them doing something to their hands and their feet, or my hands and my feet, there's a verb.
Yep.
But in Psalm 22, 16,
There's no verb.
There's no verb.
If we read it, if we take the Masoretic text, read as a lion.
So you're saying that the Masoretic text, there's something wrong here.
With a lion and with the hands and feet. Both in the Bible, every other time in the Bible has a verb. Only in this case.
Yeah, okay, so what? That does not mean that you can insert whatever verb you seem fit. Okay? That's pretty clear to me. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like many of evangelical scholars, many scholars that are still that are in the faith, that they do scholarship, they do research, but they are also Christ believers, that they get so close. Like, they read the other, the other's perspectives. They read what they would refer to as liberal scholars, but it's like they don't get it. Like, it's missing a verb, so don't make up a verb. Much less a verb that implies the knowledge and the understanding of crucifixion, which at the time of David was not common. It was certainly not a Jewish practice, and it was not something that David's enemies were known for doing. That David would fear such thing. You understand? Like, if that passage was referring to a prophetic Messiah fulfillment, like Christianity affirms, and it does so by alluding to crucifixion, before it can do that, it has to do that for the original audience first. In other words, when the first hearers of David's Psalm 22, when they first heard that, crucifixion would have had to be something they would have understood. Because if they didn't, because it was not contemporary to them, because it was not existent, then to affirm now that that's what it meant to say is to ignore a period of 1,000 years before that text becomes relevant. So how could that be God's inspiration, meant to be edifying its reader, when for over 1,000 years that rendering, right, they pierced, as Christianity would say that that's what it meant to say, or that's what it is, it would have been no sense to them. It would have been non-edifying. It would have been a complete waste of time, and most certainly unfair, in my opinion, to the Jewish believers, because for over 1,000 years, Psalm 22 just doesn't mean anything to anyone other than perhaps David just complaining. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to do better. Let's see.
Thank you, Golan. This is very helpful. Okay, well, let's talk about claim 3.
Yeah, what was claim 3?
Okay, so here's the claim that so I've heard it said, okay, so if you look in the context, there's all sorts of animals and so he's complaining about animals. Yes. He's complaining about bulls. He's complaining.
By the way, guys, I noticed that we've got some of you, and I do want to appreciate you sticking around for this video. And I do want to say I welcome questions. I welcome interaction with you. I am trying to keep up with your comments. And so I greatly appreciate it.
About dogs, he's complaining about lions, and in 2 other verses there's a complaint or a reference to lions, and so of course the Masoretic text says like a lion, and that makes sense in the context. And so because 2 other verses in Psalm 22 refer to lions, the original reading of Psalm 22, verse 16 English, verse 17 Hebrew, has to be like a lion.
Yeah, but that actually helps us. This argument actually drills the point that it couldn't be a lion because of the textual evidence.
Okay, here's what's interesting. So
Okay, so he's saying that it can't be a lion that it's referring to. Let's see. I'm excited now because that sounds like, hey, maybe this could be evidence. Let's see.
Israeli circles, which I really love. You and I've talked a lot about this whole approach to the Hebrew Bible called the close reading or the literary reading.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a very, very famous scholar named Meir Weiss. And he showed that in lament psalms, he looked at Psalm 13, and he showed that in lament psalms, the psalmist usually complains to God. You know, this is bothering me, and that is bothering me, and this is bothering me. But with every complaint, with a specific complaint, there's always a specific request. So that in the parallelism of the psalm, of a lament psalm, you have complaints and then specific requests that deal with those complaints. Now, here's what's interesting.
So this is about the structure, the
structure of the text.
Okay, I don't know why, but I certainly feel, I don't know how you feel so far, but I'm getting the impression that he's about to create his little web of mental and exegetical gymnastics to try to justify something that he already knows that couldn't have possibly be in the mind of David, which is a crucifixion, much less an event that was only relevant again 1,000 years later.
In other words, if we want to figure out what's the best reading here, let's go to the structure of the text.
Exactly.
Right? Let's look at the original Hebrew. Normally, the argument is Christians don't know the Hebrew and they're brainwashed. Is that true?
Praise the Lord. We know Hebrew. So,
okay. Your Hebrew's good, better than mine, right? So let's look at the complaints in this passage, and then let's look at the requests. So for instance, in Psalm 22, verses 1 and 11, far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning, for there is none to help. So if he's going to complain, there's none to help.
Yep.
Right? And they're far. So the
parallel request would
be what? But you, O Lord, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance.
And that's verse 19.
Verse 19. So here we go. You have the complaint. God, you're far, nobody to help. So of course you're going to request, be not far, come to my assistance. Exactly. Come to help me. Verses 12 through 13, many bulls surround me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me as a ravening and a roaring lion. And so in verses 12 and 13, he complains about bulls and lions.
And that's important because that's where we start to see the animals, right?
Okay.
Right, which none of those usages are meant to be taken as literal events, as if they were actual bulls and actual lions and actual dogs encircling King David, but he's referring to his opponents. He's referring to his enemies, those whom he feared with his life. And it's all by way of the use of metaphors. That's why you can't take all of a sudden, and that's, I think, referred to as special pleading, and affirm that in the exception of verse 17 or verse 16 in the Hebrew text, that the author was really referring to crucifixion here. You just can't. If there's a principle of biblical interpretation that even evangelicals that read Christianity into the Hebrew Bible will affirm, and that is that you just don't bring in your own preconceived notions of what the text ought to conclude, because you've already concluded in your mind that this is a Christian fulfillment, and allow that to drive not only your interpretation or what you ought to conclude from reading that text, but most significantly, with regards to the scholars and the Bible committees that take votes as to how they should translate and put it in the English or in the Spanish language. They have the responsibility to not allow their own biases to drive their decision making. But clearly, in not all Bible translations, but in many, certainly the ones that I grew up reading in church as a former Christian, have opted to do, which is to choose for you and I incorrectly this rendering of ka'ari as they pierced, when it clearly is not referring to mean to a crucifixion. All right.
So look at this. Psalm 22, verse 21, save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen, you answer me.
Parallel.
So you have a complaint about a bull, you have a request with the bulls. You've got a complaint about a lion, you've got a request about the lion.
Exactly.
In other words, it parallels. Now let's look at verse 16, okay? For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. Again, the New American Standard, they pierced my hands and my feet, or the Masoretic text, dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me, like a lion, my hands and my feet.
So now the parallel would determine this is important, because the parallel would determine what's the best reading, because we would have to look in the parallel for dogs and lions, or only dogs.
Okay, let's see. I'm excited, Golan. Let's see what's
tension in the air.
Okay, so verse 20, deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog.
The dogs. What's missing? Where's the lions?
There's no lions.
But there's a sword.
And by the way, verse 20 and verse 16 are the only verses in Psalm 22 that refer to dogs, which means they have to be parallel verses.
Yeah.
And so here we actually see the request has no lion, which means the original reading of verse 16 has no lion.
And not only that, it doesn't have a lion, it has a sword. So what's the...
No, because I think the author is still using poetic language and still using metaphor, even by its own use of the word sword. Delivered me from the sword, or delivered me from... I don't know what that sounds. That's very much a metaphor too. That could imply just deliver me from being killed. Doesn't have to necessarily mean that David had a stabbing in mind. And even if it did so, deliver me from the sword. What does that have anything to do with crucifixion? Crucifixion did not make use of swords. So even if you're right with that respect, this isn't still proving anything.
The parallel for a sword.
You need a verb that has to deal with piercing.
Exactly.
Hey, Golan, you're making me feel better already. I love it. Okay. Interestingly enough, if you look at also the structure and there's a lot of animals in this verse. And so you've got bulls, lions, dogs, lions, oxen.
And that's what one of the Israeli scholars is saying. I don't know how you say it in English, but a chiastic
structure.
Yeah, so how can you possibly fit the Roman practice of crucifixion? Even if you did have a stabbing, even if that's what David had in mind, it doesn't necessarily have to have been crucifixion.
Sure.
Exactly.
So we found, I thought this was really interesting, an Israeli scholar, Meir Malul.
Yeah, Dr. Meir Malul.
So he wrote a commentary on Psalms in modern Hebrew, and here's the quote. This is not a Christian scholar who's saying that the Christians corrupted the text. This is an Israeli Hebrew scholar.
In the period.
You see, they continue to muddy the waters by alluding that the objection to this being a Christian fulfillment is that Christians corrupted the text. No. The problem is that indeed the text itself is missing a verb, and whether or not that verb is implied to be something of a stabbing action, which we've already demonstrated that cannot be established by way of this just the lexical or the dictionary definition of the words, because it doesn't really say stabbing, but if you're going to draw that from the context, namely those parallel passages that you showed us, they still don't lead to this crucifixion interpretation.
Reviewed encyclopedia, so it's a peer reviewed. So if he made a mistake, nobody would publish it. This is a peer reviewed lexicon.
So listen to what he says. The person praying starts with bulls and mighty ones, verse 13, continues with lions, verse 14, and closes with dogs, verse 17. In the final verses, 20 through 22, the person praying starts with a dog, verse 21, continues with a lion, verse 22, and closes with wild oxen, verse 22. The reference to the lion in verse 17 is perplexing, mukshe,
Exactly. It's
from
hard.
the standpoint of the proposed chiastic structure.
So even he admits that the lion shouldn't
Don't be fooled, guys. This is just like they're making a big deal out of stuff that they're reading, but none of that is really concluding the Christian reading into it.
be there. It doesn't fit.
Which is interesting. So not only is there a problem of a missing verb in the Masoretic text, right? Like a lion, what? There's a
In
problem.
case you don't know, the Masoretic text is the most widely Hebrew version of the Jewish Bible that has existed probably since AD 500 till now, and it's what essentially Bible translators will use to translate the Old Testament, to translate the Hebrew Bible. So it's the standard, most commonly used Hebrew text in the history of Judaism.
But also there's a
and Christianity.
problem with the animals,
Exactly.
right? There is no lion in the request, the parallel request.
So it doesn't fit the chiastic structure of the psalm.
Absolutely. So
And he admits it.
So let's go on to the next claim.
Okay, so that's sort of kind of going back
this
to...
is the argument that...
So what are you retracting now? It seems to be contradicting what you were affirming before.
You know, they say that the New Testament never quotes this verse. And so it proves that the Christians corrupted the text.
Yeah. They say if it was so obvious, if it was such a messianic obvious prophecy, how come the New Testament doesn't refer to it? That's the claim.
And that is true. That is true. Even by Jesus himself, when he quotes Psalm 22 with the Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani or whatever, he limits himself to that verse in particular only, which was, my God, why have you forsaken me? But you do have to wonder that if verse 17 was indeed referring to his crucifixion, that would have been a more appropriate verse to quote, in addition to verse 1, Jesus from the cross. Not even Paul himself does that. So you do have to wonder if the New Testament authors did not consider that as part of their argument for the Jesus fulfillment, that maybe they were not aware of that rendering. Perhaps they were ignorant of it saying anything related to a crucifixion, because they clearly ignored it. So it's not enough that Jesus quoted verse 1 from the cross. I think that the authors would have done a better job at actually citing it, but they didn't.
It's interesting because already, even though we saw that there's no evidence of textual corruption, but let's address this claim, okay? Now we were talking about this, that in the original Hebrew Bible, were there chapters and verses?
Nope, no chapters, no verses. If you go to a synagogue and open the scroll, you just see letters, and sometimes there even not a gap between the words.
So I want to ask you something. So if you wanted to refer to Psalm 22 back in Jesus' day, without a chapter, how would you do it?
I would do what the rabbis do in the Midrash and in the Talmud. I would quote a verse or half a verse to let the people go to that chapter, to that section.
You know, it reminds me of a story years ago.
Right. So what are you saying? That because Jesus quoted the first verse that meant that we ought to, as readers of the New Testament, go back and try to apply everything to the crucifixion from Psalm 22. So if you're going to simply pick and choose verse 17 that seems to point to a piercing torture that you're taking to say that, well, that's the fulfillment of the crucifixion, then what about the other stuff? What about, okay, the casting of the lots? Yeah, that's a possibility. But what about the dogs? What about the other animals that are mentioned as part of that entire passage? And not to mention the theological implications of Jesus affirming the abandonment of God, if you are affirming at the same time the Christian doctrine of homoousios, or the same essence, that the Son partakes of the same divine essence with the Father and the Holy Spirit, as to say that they're both fully divine, and that's how they are one and not three separate gods. That what's happening at the cross, if Jesus is really being abandoned, is there a separation? Can there be a separation? I'm not so sure.
I was in Eilat, and I met an Israeli guy that it was interesting. He told me, he said, my dad, when I was young, he wanted me to be a rabbi, and he locked me. He said this.
From an ultra-Orthodox family.
He said he locked me in my room for 2 years. I didn't believe that, right? But then he said to me, and he made me memorize the book of Psalms. I said, get out of here. Memorize it. He said, no, read a beginning of any psalm, and I will finish it for you. And so sure enough, I'd start the psalm.
They couldn't say, Seth, please go to Psalm 22.
He just kind of goes off in a tangent story.
Verse, no numbers, no verses. So this is how he said, go to that psalm, go to 22.
And you know what's really interesting? If we look now at Matthew 27, by the way, Matthew's account of the crucifixion is filled with allusions to Psalm 22. But in verse 35, it says this, and when they had crucified him, what do you do when you crucify somebody? You pierce their hands and their feet. They divided.
No, I'm not so sure about that. I don't know. In the chat, someone could contribute, but I think that there are even entire Christian denominations that don't even believe that Jesus was pierced or nailed to a cross, and that perhaps the more common practice, which makes sense to me, was that they were tied to the cross. Because really, the point was not for them to bleed to death as they would if they were to be pierced by giant iron nails, which just with the weight alone could tear through their tissue. And I know that, there's some would argue that perhaps people were not pierced through the middle of their palm, but through the wrist. And so therefore the wrist bones would have kept the person hanging. But I think it would have complicated things more for the Romans if that was their common practice. So not even all of Christian tradition agrees that there was even nailing happening.
Up his garments, which is exactly also from Psalm 22.
Exactly.
Here's a couple of clear allusions to Psalm 22. They divided up his garments among them by casting lots. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud.
And by the way, just because the New Testament authors allude or cite the Hebrew Bible doesn't mean that they're correct in doing so. You have to already presuppose that the New Testament is the word of the same God, and that it is a continuation or an update of the Old Testament, in order for you to be able to accept many of these presuppositions. But when you don't, then it sounds like it's saying something else. That's the problem.
Loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani.
Why did you
Right?
forsake
That
me?
is, my God, why have you forsaken me? So here we actually have a New Testament reference to Psalm 22 with a very strong allusion to verse 16.
A bold reference to you can say the headline of the psalm. Go to that psalm.
Now, again,
Right. And by the way, I would venture to affirm that Psalm 22 was not describing David's own death, as if to say that these passages, namely Psalm 22 and the crucifixion passages in the New Testament, are analogous or parallel. Like, this happened to David, well, that's also going to happen to Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the Messiah. That doesn't even happen. David is not sacrificed. There is no, other than this, I don't think there are even any passages in the Hebrew Bible that would affirm that their Messiah had to be killed. So this is just clear Christian reading into the Hebrew Bible.
we looked at this Israeli scholar that's a Psalm scholar. What did he actually say about this verse?
So that's actually amazing, because he says, of course, there's a problem if it's a lion, that it doesn't make any sense. But he argues the better reading is with pierced, ka'aru, to pierced, and he alludes to John 11:44 or John 19:37, where we see tied. How do you say, to tie somebody?
To bind your hands and feet,
like Lazarus, or to pierce, what John says, we shall look at him who was pierced, from Zechariah. Yeah. So this Israeli scholar is saying the better reading of Psalm 22:17.
Actually, that verb in Zechariah should not be translated as they shall look upon him whom was pierced. Actually, what it says is cut off. But that's going to be another episode, because that's yet another example of how New Testament authors, along with Christian apologists and missionaries, are completely misreading the Hebrew Bible.
15 or 16 would be pierced, and John quotes it or give the allusion.
So he's actually saying that the New Testament probably represents the better reading.
Exactly.
Wait a minute,
Exactly.
but
And that's an
Israeli scholar
who doesn't believe, who is not, he's probably is either religious or secular Jew.
So are you saying then that Christians that don't know Hebrew are not brainwashed, right? You're telling me that it's still that they've not corrupted the text.
Of course, and those Israeli scholars are not brainwashed as well. They're not Messianic Jews.
They're not.
It's not about them being corrupt. It's not about them corrupting the text. It's about what you're concluding that the text is saying. That's the problem.
Not trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. No. They're just simply trying to go with the evidence.
Exactly, and they want to know what's the best meaning of the text.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Claim 5.
And that's the final claim.
Claim 5. Psalm 22 is just about David.
Yeah, and this is one of the most common claims that we see all through the Bible. That they just, the pshat, this is just the historical event and nothing more. This is only about David and no prophecy whatsoever.
Now, we should at some point do an episode on the literary structure of the whole book of Psalms and why it's probably messianic. But let's look right now for just at Psalm 22. Is this just about David? Once again, we look at the literary structure of the psalm.
Yep.
What do you notice about the literary structure of Psalm 22?
Okay, let's hear it.
It's almost as if it divided to two sections. There's lament, there's cry, there's suffering, but it doesn't end there.
How does it end?
With praise. And not only praise, the nations, the goyim, the nations are praising God. Why? What happened?
So here's what's amazing about this chapter. Psalm 22 is divided into two halves. The first half is a lament, and it's a terrible lament about horrific sufferings. But then suddenly there's this dramatic and inexplicable.
And by the way, these horrific sufferings are events that David himself, as the king of the Jews, was experiencing, or it's claimed that he experienced. And I know that Christian theology will say that in the end times, or it's the second coming, when Jesus becomes the king, the Messiah, because clearly he never was. I mean, a lot of people confuse, or at least when I was a believer, that, there's that episode at the crucifixion or on the way to crucifixion where Jesus is mocked and he's labeled on the cross as the King of the Jews. I mean, we've all heard that in church. But that's a mockery. That was not like an actual coronation. Not that you would ever argue that he was at some point king, but the truth still remains, he never was king. Have you ever wondered that? So how could this passage relate to Jesus of Nazareth in the same way that David related to it when Jesus himself was not even king? I don't see how.
Transition to praise, but not just any praise. From this terrible suffering of one individual who's being mauled and beaten and pierced and mocked, the psalm ends with all the nations praising the Lord. Let me read verses 27 through 28.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, by the way, before he continues on reading, I do want to show you something that's really important here, because they're going to read these verses and you're going to hear the Lord this, the Lord that, the praise to the Lord. And what often happens is readers of the New Testament, because they're so accustomed to reading Christ the Lord, or in church, the Lord Jesus Christ, and you hear that often, that somehow this passage must therefore be also referring to the Lord in that way. When in reality, what's happening is, and I'm trying to pull up the text here as I'm speaking, is the word in the Hebrew that you're actually reading as Lord is not Lord. Okay. It's the name Yahweh. So the person that this passage, this psalm, is leading you to conclude that ought to get all this glory and credit, it's not this future Messiah, but rather Yahweh himself. In other words, the author himself is being very specific as to what person or what God ought to take the credit of this praise, and that's Yahweh. It's just that, which is a separate God altogether. It's not the Father. It's not this general concept of God, but rather one being in particular, one God among the many, and that God is named Yahweh. So it does not read Lord that you could then go back and think, all right, maybe it is about Christ the Lord, when it's not. Okay, here we go.
All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations.
Right. So let me back it up here so that you can see it. If this psalm was really trying to point prophetically to this future messianic fulfillment, this crucifixion, that it wouldn't lead you to conclude that you then ought to worship Yahweh. Because what ends up happening in Christianity is that, never mind Yahweh, because the Lord is actually Jesus himself. You see where this is going? How could Yahweh inspire Psalm 22, which concludes in the exaltation of his own name, to have originally meant a future fulfillment that would not lead into the worship and praise and the exaltation of his name, but rather the exaltation and the praise of a completely different character? That's what you need to see.
All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. We have to come up with some kind of an explanation.
You do have to ask, did that actually come true? Did all the nations repent and turn and praise the name of Yahweh as a result of Christianity coming into the scene? I don't think so. Quite the opposite.
Because David did suffer, but when did we ever see David in the Bible brings salvation and praise to the whole nation? We don't see the latter part. We don't see the second part.
You know, the language here suggests a fulfillment of sorts of the Abrahamic, God's promise to Abraham that God would bless all the nations of the earth. And so somehow we have to reconcile, if we're going to explain the meaning of this psalm, we have to reconcile the horrific sufferings and the lament of this individual to the universal praise that all nations, as a result of the suffering of this individual, are praising the Lord. Does that sound like David to you?
Praising what Lord? One Lord specifically, and that Lord is Yahweh. And that's not Jesus.
The suffering of David didn't bring the salvation or the glory of God to the ends of the world. We don't have any verses in the Bible that says that.
That's right, which is the reason why you can't take this psalm and say, well, this is talking about Jesus, because the scenarios are different.
You think of any other person, any other Jewish person who suffered so terribly, whose garments were divided, whose hands and feet were pierced, right? Who was taunted and mocked. Can you think of any other Jewish person?
Yeah, and I can also think of many other martyrs of other religions that have had to endure and suffer many great things for their faith. And that does not necessarily mean that they were somehow divine, right? Because if that's the case, then what would the difference be? How could you discern between this divine fulfillment through, say, someone that is of the Hindu religion or the Islamic religion, right? Certainly, many people have died. Many people have suffered for their beliefs. And that's not good enough measure to say, well, that's indeed evidence that this one guy who also suffered, that somehow that's him too. Or that at least the Hebrew Bible prophesied that he would die in this way, and therefore we gotta believe that this is true.
Person that suffered so terribly, and as a result, all the nations are praising the Lord.
There was this ancient rabbi.
What was his name?
Yeshua in Hebrew.
So I want to show you something really interesting as we're going to conclude here. But if you look at the dramatic shift from lament to praise in Psalm 22, it says this: I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. I find that really amazing that when Yeshua met with Mary after his resurrection, notice what he says in Matthew 28, verse 10.
And that's a unique call, right? A unique reference, brethren.
Yeah.
Right?
So he says, then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and take word to my brethren.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I haven't been showing the screen, but I am so shocked. What's he saying here? That because Jesus refers to his disciples as my brethren here on Matthew 28:10, that because Psalm 22 uses a word that gets translated to brethren, that therefore that's evidence that Jesus is the fulfillment of this, or that somehow those passages are to be connected? I mean, am I reading you? Am I listening? Am I hearing you correctly?
To leave for Galilee, and there they will see me. The fact that Jesus,
It's not common, right?
he says, my brethren, given the fact that so much of the crucifixion in Matthew is described in light of Psalm 22, this is an allusion. Jesus is saying, listen, the suffering is over. Let the praises begin. And by using the word my brethren, Jesus is saying, I fulfilled the first half.
Exactly.
I've now fulfilled the second half.
Amen.
Then
It gets better.
it gets better. Again, let's go back to Psalm 22, verses 27 through 28. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations.
The kingdom is Yahweh's, not Jesus.
Wow, that sounds an awful lot like the Great Commission.
Like the
Oh, okay, yeah, for sure. Because it's really the same thing, right? It's the Great Commission is not that all the nations turn around and repent and acknowledge that Yahweh is God and that they've fully embraced the Levitical law because their hearts become circumcised, whatever that's supposed to mean, which I'd like to do an episode on that at some point in the future. What does it mean to be circumcised in the heart? But what happens with the Great Commission is the complete opposite. Is the Christian apostles are given the mandate to take this new message, namely the gospel, which is not repent and recognize that Yahweh is Lord, but rather that you don't need the Levitical law anymore because there's a one sacrifice that nullifies or fulfills the whole law into this one sacrifice, however that's supposed to be. And then they take that message to the world. So it's a completely different effect. But they want to make they want to make this sound like it's the same, but it's not.
The ending of Matthew.
And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations.
Amen.
Baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And lo,
notice that the language changes in Christianity. They refer to God as the Father. Have you noticed that? I mean, there might be a sense in which Jews could refer to God as Abba, colloquially speaking, perhaps, but it's pretty remarkable how in Christianity they completely bury the whole concept of the Jewish God having a name, and that taking away or somehow being at competition with this other name that's now on the scene, and how they just blur those lines by referring to God as the Father. Mo has a question. Is God circumcised? Man, that's a great question. I think there might be a rabbinic tradition that could have contemplated that question, but I'm not sure if the Hebrew Bible itself can confirm that. What I have heard other prominent scholars affirm, such as Stravakapulu in her God, the Anatomy book, that clearly the Hebrew Bible does teach that Yahweh had actual testicles and a big penis. But was he circumcised? I'm not sure. I think it's possible, but I don't know. The same question was done of Adam. I've heard others question, was Adam circumcised? Because if he was the first one, then who could have done it? And I think that there's a rabbinic tradition that affirms that Yahweh created Adam already circumcised. But they're just rationalizing the text, because I don't think the text actually says that.
I'm with you
Thank you for the
always,
question.
even to the ends of the earth.
So it's not David, but it's the son of David.
The son of David.
I do want to do an episode on circumcision, because this much I know. The Jews did not invent circumcision. It is not original to the Jewish religion. The Egyptians invented circumcision. And so there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about as to like, why did the Egyptians do this? Like, what's the thinking behind it? Because we don't really hear much from the Christian church about like why that was the thing. It was just that God ordered Abraham to do it, and therefore everyone else should follow suit. And then somehow in Christianity that becomes not unnecessary, and so that tradition is lost. But they don't really tell us why. But I think if you look into what the Egyptians believed, it does make a lot of sense. But I won't spoil it, because it's going to be a future episode to come for sure.
David, amen. Amen. So let's sum things up here, okay? Just to sum things up. So if we could kind of tie things together, are the claims of the anti-missionaries true about Psalm 22 and that we corrupted the text?
First claim, the first claim was about corruption. We saw that there was no corruption whatsoever, no evidence, and even Israeli scholars are debating what's the true meaning, and they're admitting that a lion is causing a lot of problems because we need a verb, and we need something to be something to compare with piercing, with the sword.
Amazing, amazing. Another claim that the literary structure, right? So we're saying that the literary structure proves that it cannot be like a lion.
Exactly, because of the power, because of this, what the scholars call the chiastic structure. We have a dog, and then dogs.
No, because if it is like the Jewish publication affirms that it is like a lion, they mold. In other words, the lion, something the lions do to one's hands and feet, that they are incorrect, that they're correct in their interpretation, then that poses no issues. I've even read some interpreters that would argue that what the author is actually trying to communicate is the overall feeling that a person that might be being hunted by a pack of lions, how they might feel, figuratively speaking. And what the scholar is talking about is that when the text says, like my hands and feet, is referring to how if you were encircled by a pack of lions, as a human being and as any other prey would feel, two things. Number one, the inability to run from a pack of lions. And number two, the ability to do anything for yourself when faced with an attack of a pack of lions. And that's where the author is alluding to, like a lion, they mold my hands and feet, is not a literal mauling or biting or tearing of your limbs, because it's not a literal reading, but it's more of a figurative poetic language. And that is, they take away my ability. I am experiencing a moment in my life, is what I think David is saying, where I have lost my own inability to run or make use of my feet and to defend myself and make use of my hands, which is what a person under a lion attack would feel like. Does that make sense? But if you introduce crucifixion into this, it doesn't make sense.
And we don't have a lion. We have a sword, and we have pierced.
Amen.
And we don't have a sword. The word sword is not on verse 17.
The literary structure also supports the original reading pierced.
Yes,
what they're doing is that it's mentioned at a verse later in that psalm, and they're matching it by way of these, what they call, referred to as chiastic structures, or it's when authors would oftentimes compose a passage where verses are parallel, leading to a main message. And that might be happening here, but it's still not enough for you to affirm that this is pointing to a future crucifixion.
What about the claim that the New Testament never quotes Psalm 22?
We saw that the New Testament absolutely refers to this chapter and quite clearly alludes to Psalm 22:16, and that's exactly what some Israeli scholars are saying as well.
And
it alludes to it, but because you're insisting on a Christian in a Christian rendering of it, and it seems obvious, but it does. They don't quote it. They don't quote it directly, and so you do have to wonder why wouldn't they quote it? Because that seems to be more important than to simply cite, "Well, my God, why have you abandoned me?"
Final claim: could Psalm 22 talk just about David? Could it talk just about the historical figure of King David?
Listen, I've been all over the world, and there are, you meet Gentiles from the far reaches of the world, and they know about Jesus. They know about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. How do they know about him? Because of the sufferings and the resurrection of one Jewish man.
You know what you remind me of? A dear brother that we both know went to India to visit believers. And he came to in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, to an Indian village. And this Indian guy comes to him and hugs him. And he said, "You're the second Jew that I meet. You're the second Jew." He said, "Who's the first one?" Yeshua.
Amen.
Yeah, okay. So now they're going to pray, and I'll spare you from that. But here we go, folks. So you have seen it for yourselves. We have given them an opportunity to show us why we should read the crucifixion in Psalm 22, verse 17. And we have discussed the many reasons why I reject such position. And I want to give you all an opportunity to, if you have any questions, any comments, any concerns that we could answer as we continue on live. It's been an hour and 53 minutes. Those of you that have been with us since the beginning, I greatly appreciate your presence. I thank you for paying me an ear. And this has been really great so far. It's I'm liking doing lives with you guys. And let's see here. Yeah, they're doing lots of mental gymnastics. That's the way the only way they could do it is to find ways to link passages from the Old to the New Testament, and then try to make their case on Jesus. That's right, Mo. That's great. Jesus has better marketing team than Yahweh. That's right. They did an awesome job helping people forget. And I think it was both a combination of the Jews' practice of avoiding to pronounce their God's name in fear that they might mispronounce it and therefore blaspheme against their God, coupled with the rebranding of the translation of the word Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament scriptures, but first and foremost into the LXX, or the Greek Old Testament, by using the Greek kurios, which can translate and is often translated as Lord. And that is what erases any originality of the name of the Jewish God from the Bible. And so once you erase the name of Yahweh, then you can then superimpose the new name, or the replacement of the deity or the object of worship, in this case Jesus himself. So it's been awesome, guys. It's been a pleasure. And given that I've not seen any more comments, I am going to begin to say my goodbyes, and want to tell you that I appreciate your presence here, and it's been fun. I'm going to go ahead and end this broadcast. But like always, this has been Apostate of Mind. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.